The crystal dome of Lumiere stretched endlessly above the Grand Assembly Hall, its translucent surface catching and refracting the light of distant stars into a cascade of ethereal rainbows. For 1,000 years, this magnificent structure on Nexus Prime had served as the beating heart of galactic diplomacy, where representatives from across the Milky Way gathered to maintain the peace that had become as natural as breathing to the civilizations within the Galactic Alliance. Ambassador Kelviran adjusted his ceremonial robes, the deep blue fabric adorned with the silver star emblem of humanity, as he walked through the corridors leading to the main assembly chamber. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors, each step carrying the weight of representing not just Earth, but the dozens of human colonies scattered across the galaxy. Today marked the 500th Peace Conference, a milestone that should have been cause for celebration. Yet something in the air felt different. "Ambassador," called Len Sora, his diplomatic aide, hurrying to catch up with quick, efficient steps. Her datapad glowed with the latest briefings, and her sharp eyes held a hint of concern that she tried to mask with professional composure. "The seating arrangements have been finalized. The Gray Nebula Collective has requested a position directly across from our delegation." Kale raised an eyebrow, his weathered face showing the accumulated wisdom of decades spent navigating the delicate waters of interstellar politics. "Interesting choice. They usually prefer the shadows in the back rows. Any idea what's prompted this sudden desire for visibility?" "None of our intelligence networks have picked up anything concrete," Len replied, her fingers dancing across the datapad's surface as she pulled up relevant files. "But there have been whispers. Some of our contacts in the Outer Rim mention increased military exercises in Gray Nebula space, ships moving in formations not seen since the last territorial disputes 3 centuries ago." The massive doors to the assembly hall slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sight that never failed to inspire awe, even in someone as experienced as Kale. The chamber was a marvel of architectural achievement, capable of accommodating thousands of delegates from hundreds of different species. Each section carefully designed to meet the unique environmental needs of its occupants. Methane-breathing entities occupied pressurized glass enclosures, while energy beings flickered and pulsed in specialized containment fields. The diversity was staggering, a living testament to the alliance that had brought peace to a galaxy once torn by endless wars. As Kale took his designated seat at the human delegation's table, he noticed the subtle tension that seemed to permeate the usual pre-conference chatter. Conversations were quieter, more guarded, and many delegates kept glancing toward the section reserved for the Gray Nebula Collective. When those representatives finally entered, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The Gray Nebula beings were an imposing sight. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies were covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating that shifted between silver and deep gray, depending on the angle of the light. Their faces were angular and severe, with eyes that glowed with an inner fire that spoke of ancient warrior traditions. They had been among the most reluctant to join the Galactic Alliance originally, and their integration had been a delicate process that took decades to complete. Their leader, Warlord Thexan, moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his every step calculated and purposeful. As he took his position at the head of their delegation, his burning gaze swept across the assembly, lingering for a moment on the human section with what could only be described as barely contained hostility. The ceremonial opening proceeded according to tradition. Ancient chants in long-dead languages filled the air. Holographic displays showed the charter that had established the Galactic Alliance, and speaker after speaker took the podium to reaffirm their commitment to peace and cooperation. It was all wonderfully predictable, a comfortable routine that had been followed for 5 centuries. Then everything changed. As the formal proceedings reached their midpoint, Warlord Thexan rose from his seat, his massive form casting a shadow across the chamber. The traditional talking stick, A crystalline artifact that granted speaking rights materialized in his armored hands. The soft murmur of conversation died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete that the gentle hum of the environmental systems became audible. Delegates of the Galactic Alliance. Thexon's voice resonated through the chamber, amplified by the acoustic design to reach every corner clearly. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, each syllable precisely enunciated. For a millennium, we have gathered in this place under the banner of peace. We have celebrated our unity, our cooperation, our shared commitment to a galaxy free from the devastation of war. Heads nodded throughout the assembly. This seemed like the beginning of yet another ceremonial speech, affirming the Alliance's values. Several delegates began to relax, settling back in their seats for what promised to be a long but predictable address. But peace built on willful blindness is no peace at all, Thexon continued, his voice growing harder with each word. Peace that ignores growing threats is merely a delayed catastrophe. And so, with the authority vested in me by the War Council of the Grey Nebula Collective, I hereby declare that the state of peace between our peoples has ended. The silence that followed was deafening. For several heartbeats, it seemed as if the entire assembly was holding its breath, unable to process what they had just heard. The word war hadn't been spoken in this chamber for over 300 years, and many of the younger delegates had never heard it used in anything but historical context. We declare war, Thexon announced with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, upon humanity. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates leaped to their feet, voices raised in shock and dismay. The carefully maintained order of the assembly dissolved into chaos as representatives from dozens of species began shouting questions, demands for explanation, and pleas for reconsideration. The chamber filled with a cacophony of sounds as universal translators struggled to keep up with the multilingual outburst. In the midst of this pandemonium, one sound cut through the noise like a blade through silk. It was unexpected, incongruous, and utterly bewildering to everyone who heard it. Laughter. Not just any laughter, but the rich, genuine amusement of someone who had just heard the funniest joke of their lifetime. It was coming from the human delegation, where Ambassador Kale Viran was leaning back in his chair, his shoulders shaking with mirth. Around him, his fellow humans were displaying various degrees of amusement, from barely contained chuckles to outright guffaws. The chaos gradually subsided as the other delegates turned to stare at the humans in bewilderment. Even Warlord Thexon seemed taken aback by this response, his prepared follow-up speech dying on his lips as he tried to understand what he was witnessing. Kale wiped tears of laughter from his eyes and slowly stood, his diplomatic training warring with his inability to maintain a serious expression. "Forgive me, Warlord Thexon," he said, his voice still tinged with amusement. "But I have to ask, is this some sort of joke? Because if it is, it's absolutely brilliant. The timing, the delivery, the complete seriousness with which you said it. Chef's kiss." Len leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, but Kale waved her off with a gentle gesture. His eyes were bright with the kind of merriment usually reserved for family gatherings and old friends sharing stories. "I assure you, human, this is no jest," Thexon replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "The Grey Nebula Collective has deliberated for months. We have reached the inescapable conclusion that your species represents a clear and present danger to galactic stability." This statement only seemed to amuse Kale further. He turned to address the assembly at large, his arms spread wide in a gesture of inclusion. "My fellow delegates, I think we may be witnessing a historic first, a declaration of war based on a complete misunderstanding of the target." Murmurs rippled through the chamber as delegates exchanged confused glances. The tension was still palpable, but Kale's infectious good humor was beginning to affect the atmosphere, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Warlord Thexan, Kale continued, turning back to face the Gray Nebula leader. I'm genuinely curious about this danger you perceive. In the past 1,000 years of peace, what exactly have we humans done that strikes you as threatening? Have we been secretly building fleets, amassing weapons, plotting galactic conquest? Thexan's expression grew even more severe, if such a thing were possible. He gestured, and a holographic display materialized above the center of the chamber, showing what appeared to be astronomical charts and tactical analyses. Your species spreads across the galaxy like a plague, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Wherever humans go, chaos follows. You destabilize ecosystems, disrupt established orders, and leave a trail of unintended consequences that threatens us all. The display shifted to show a series of incidents. A space station where a human research team's attempt to develop better food preservation had accidentally created a new form of algae that now covered an entire moon in brilliant purple. A mining colony where human engineers, trying to improve efficiency, had somehow caused the planet's magnetic field to shift, creating spectacular aurora displays that had attracted so many tourists, the local government had to impose visitor limits. You see, Thexan continued, his voice rising with passion. Unpredictability incarnate. Your species cannot exist without causing disruption. You call it progress, innovation, exploration. We call it chaos. Kale studied the holographic evidence with the attention of a scholar examining ancient texts. His expression grew more and more amused as each example was presented. Finally, he couldn't contain himself any longer. Oh, this is even better than I thought, he said, his laughter bubbling up again. Warlord Thexan, you're declaring war on us because we're clumsy? Because we occasionally make mistakes that turn out to be happy accidents. He gestured toward the display, which now showed images of the purple moon, its surface gleaming like a jewel in space. That algae incident you mentioned? That moon is now one of the most beautiful sights in the galaxy. Poets write verses about it. Artists travel from across the sector to paint its sunrises. The display shifted to show the mining planet with its artificial auroras. And this one? The local economy has tripled thanks to tourism. They've gone from a struggling industrial outpost to a thriving cultural center. The planetary governor sent us a thank you letter. Len stood and activated her own datapad, adding supporting information to the holographic display. If I may, Ambassador, she interjected, with the smooth professionalism that had made her invaluable to the diplomatic corps. We've compiled a comprehensive list of these so-called disasters that the warlord references. New images began cycling through the display. A space station that had been accidentally turned into a massive greenhouse, now feeding 3 star systems. A failed attempt at creating artificial gravity that had instead produced a zero-gravity sports arena that was the site of the galaxy's most popular athletic competitions. An experimental engine that had exploded spectacularly, creating a nebula so beautiful that 2 civilizations had ended a century-long war just to jointly preserve it as a natural monument. You see the pattern here? Kale asked, his voice carrying genuine warmth rather than mockery. Yes, we humans tend to stumble our way through the galaxy, making mistakes and having accidents. But somehow, inexplicably, most of those mistakes turn out to make things better, not worse. Dr. Elena Vostok, the senior scientist in the human delegation, rose from her seat. She was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that sparkled with intellectual curiosity, known throughout the scientific community for her groundbreaking work in xenobiology. Warlord Thexan, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying the complexities of galactic civilization. I believe I understand your concern. The Gray Nebula Collective values order, predictability, and careful planning. These are admirable traits that have served your people well for millennia. She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. But what you perceive as chaos, we see as adaptability. What you call unpredictability, we call creativity. Yes, we make mistakes. Yes, we cause unintended consequences. But we also learn, adapt, and somehow manage to turn our failures into successes. She gestured toward the display, which now showed a timeline of human expansion through the galaxy. In the 1,000 years since we joined the Galactic Alliance, how many wars have humans started? How many civilizations have we conquered? How many planets have we destroyed? The silence that followed was telling. The answer, as everyone in the chamber knew, was 0. Instead, Dr. Vostok continued, we've helped establish medical centers that serve dozens of species. We've developed technologies that have improved life for billions of beings. We've mediated disputes, facilitated trade agreements, and yes, occasionally created beautiful accidents that bring joy to entire star systems. Ambassador Drax of the Crystalline Consortium, whose people were known for their logical approach to all matters, rose from his section. His body, composed of living mineral formations, caught and reflected the chamber's lights as he spoke. "If I may interject," he said, his voice carrying the harmonic resonance characteristic of his species. The statistical evidence supports Dr. Vostok's assertions. In the past millennium, regions of space with significant human presence have experienced a 78% decrease in armed conflicts, a 156% increase in cross-cultural collaboration, and a 234% increase in what our sociologists term beneficial, serendipitous outcomes. This pronouncement caused a stir throughout the assembly. The Crystalline Consortium was renowned for their impartial analysis and mathematical precision. If they said the statistics supported humanity's positive influence, few would dare to argue with the data. Warlord Thexan's expression grew thunderous. "Statistics and mathematics cannot capture the essence of the threat," he declared, his voice echoing off the chamber's walls. "It is not what they have done, but what they represent: chaos, unpredictability, the antithesis of order." He activated his own data display, showing detailed analyses of human behavioral patterns. Observe their history, even on their own world, before they reached the stars. They were agents of constant change. They would rather adapt their environment than adapt themselves to it. They see a mountain and decide it should be elsewhere. They see a desert and decide it should bloom. They see the impossible and decide it should be possible. The display showed images from Earth's history: the pyramids, the Great Wall, cities rising from swamps, gardens flourishing in wastelands, humans flying through the sky, diving to the deepest ocean trenches, and eventually reaching for the stars themselves. "This is the mindset that we cannot coexist with," Thexan continued, his conviction unwavering. "Order requires acceptance of natural limitations. Peace requires respect for established boundaries. Stability demands that some things remain unchanged." Kale listened to this passionate speech with the attention of someone genuinely trying to understand a different perspective. When Thexan finished, he nodded thoughtfully before responding. "Warlord, I think I finally understand what this is really about," he said, his voice gentle but clear. "This isn't about war, not really. This is about fear. You're afraid that our way of approaching the universe might somehow contaminate yours." He stepped forward, his movement slow and non-threatening, as if approaching a startled animal. "But here's the thing you're missing. We're not trying to change you. We're not trying to make the Gray Nebula Collective more like humanity. We respect your love of order, your appreciation for tradition, your commitment to careful planning." He gestured broadly to encompass the entire chamber. "That's what this alliance is about. Not making everyone the same, but creating a space where different approaches can coexist. Your order balances our chaos. Our creativity complements your structure. Together, we create something stronger than either could achieve alone." Len stepped forward, activating another holographic display that showed collaborative projects between humans and the Gray Nebula Collective. "In fact, Warlord, some of our most successful joint ventures have been with your people. The Titan shipyards, where Gray Nebula engineering precision combined with human innovative design has produced the most advanced vessels in the galaxy. The Harmony Research Station, where your systematic approach to data collection has allowed our researchers to make breakthroughs that would have been impossible alone." The evidence was compelling, but Thexan's expression remained unmoved. "Pretty words and selective examples cannot disguise the fundamental incompatibility," he declared. "The Gray Nebula Collective has reached its decision. We will not share a galaxy with a species that cannot accept the natural order of things." It was at this moment that something shifted in the chamber's atmosphere. The other delegates, who had been watching this exchange with growing fascination, began to react in ways that no one had anticipated. Ambassador Ixus of the Aquatic Federation, whose species rarely showed emotion, began to emit the low harmonic sounds that indicated amusement among her people. The sound spread to other aquatic delegates, creating a subsonic chorus that resonated through the water-filled sections of the chamber. The avian collective's representatives, perched in their aerial platforms, began the rhythmic wing rustling that served as their equivalent of laughter. Soon, dozens of species were displaying their own versions of amusement, creating a symphony of mirth that filled the Great Hall. Warlord Thexan looked around the chamber with growing confusion and anger. "You find this amusing?" he demanded, his voice rising above the sounds of merriment. "We declare war, and you laugh." It was then that Ambassador Movian of the Silicon Plains spoke up. His crystalline form pulsed with the slow, measured rhythms of deep thought as he addressed the assembly. "Honored Warlord," he said, his voice carrying the weight of geological time. "In my people's long memory, we have seen many declarations of war. They usually involve armies, fleets, weapons of devastating power. They speak of territory to be conquered, resources to be claimed, ideologies to be imposed." His form shifted, light refracting through his structure in patterns that indicated deep amusement. "But you, noble warrior, have declared war because humans occasionally make mistakes that turn out well. You would fight a species because they improve things by accident. You would shed blood because they refuse to accept that mountains cannot be moved." The absurdity of the situation seemed to crystallize in that moment. Here was a 1,000-year-old peace, one of the greatest achievements in galactic history, being threatened not by territorial disputes or resource conflicts or ideological differences, but by one species' fundamental disagreement with another's approach to problem-solving. Kale seized the moment, his diplomatic instincts recognizing the opportunity that had presented itself. "Warlord Thexan," he said, his voice carrying across the now quieting chamber, "I have a proposition for you." The Gray Nebula leader turned his burning gaze toward the human ambassador, clearly suspicious of whatever was coming next. "If you truly believe that our species are incompatible, if you genuinely think that humanity represents such a threat to galactic order that war is the only solution, then let's settle this properly," Kale continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. He stepped into the center of the chamber, directly beneath the holographic displays, placing himself in full view of every delegate present. "I challenge the Gray Nebula Collective to a contest, not a war. We've all seen enough of those to last several lifetimes. But a proper competition, with clearly defined rules and measurable outcomes." The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was charged with anticipation rather than shock. This was clearly not what anyone had expected from a declaration of war. "What manner of contest?" Thexan asked, his warrior's instincts apparently intrigued despite his political position. Kale smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had gotten humanity out of more diplomatic crises than anyone cared to count. A series of challenges designed to test our respective approaches to problem solving. Your people value order, planning, and systematic execution. My people value creativity, adaptability, and innovative thinking. Let's see which approach produces better results. Len stepped forward with her datapad, having anticipated this direction and prepared accordingly. "We propose 5 challenges," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Each designed to test different aspects of civilization building and problem solving. The holographic display shifted to show the proposed challenges. First, terraforming. Both sides will be given identical barren worlds and asked to make them habitable. We'll see whose approach produces better results for the inhabitants. Murmurs of interest rippled through the assembly. Terraforming was one of the most complex and challenging endeavors any civilization could undertake, requiring expertise in dozens of scientific disciplines. Second, diplomatic crisis resolution. We'll present both sides with a series of hypothetical conflicts between fictional species and see whose solutions prove more effective and lasting. This drew nods of approval from many delegates, who recognized the practical value of such a test. Third, technological innovation. Both sides will be given the same basic materials and asked to develop new technologies to solve specific problems. Effectiveness, efficiency, and creativity will all be evaluated. Fourth, cultural integration. Each side will be asked to design a system for helping newly contacted civilizations join the galactic community while preserving their unique characteristics. And finally, crisis response. We'll simulate a galaxy-wide emergency and see whose approach to coordination and problem-solving produces the best outcomes. Kale looked directly at Warlord Thexan as he delivered the final terms. The winner of the majority of challenges gets to dictate the terms of future human-Grey Nebula relations. If you win, we'll accept whatever restrictions you believe are necessary to maintain galactic order. If we win, he paused dramatically. You acknowledge that our approach has value and agree to continue the alliance as equals. The chamber erupted in excited conversation as delegates discussed this unprecedented proposal. Never before had a declaration of war been answered with a challenge to a peaceful competition. The idea was so audacious, so completely contrary to traditional responses to military threats, that it caught everyone off guard. Thexan stood silent for long minutes, his inner council of Grey Nebula advisors surrounding him in urgent, whispered conversation. The warrior traditions of his people demanded acceptance of any fairly offered challenge, but this was so far outside their usual framework that they needed time to consider the implications. Finally, he stepped forward again. His decision made. The Grey Nebula Collective accepts your challenge, human, but we add our own condition. The competition will be observed and judged by a panel drawn from the neutral members of the Galactic Alliance. No species involved in the contest will have a voice in determining the winner. This was immediately agreed upon, and within minutes, a judging panel was selected consisting of representatives from the Crystalline Consortium, the Quantum Consciousness Network, the Bioharmonic Symphony, the Geometric Perfectionists, and the Eternal Observers, 5 species known throughout the galaxy for their impartiality and analytical capabilities. As the details of the competition were being worked out, something remarkable happened. The atmosphere in the chamber, which had been charged with tension and confusion just hours earlier, began to transform into something resembling a festival. Delegates who had been preparing for the potential outbreak of the First Galactic War in a millennium were now discussing the logistics of the most unusual peaceful competition in recorded history. Dr. Vostok found herself in animated conversation with Grey Nebula scientists about the theoretical approaches to terraforming. Military advisors from both sides were comparing notes on crisis response protocols. Even Warlord Thexan seemed to be enjoying his discussions with the competition judges about the specific criteria that would be used to evaluate each challenge. "You know," Len said quietly to Kale, as they watched the transformation taking place around them. "I'm not sure if you're a diplomatic genius or completely insane." Kale chuckled, the sound carrying none of the sharp amusement from earlier, but rather the warm satisfaction of someone who had just prevented a catastrophic mistake. "Maybe both. But look around. Does this look like the beginning of a war to you?" Indeed. The Great Chamber now resembled nothing so much as the planning session for a grand celebration. Species that had barely spoken to each other in decades were collaborating on observer protocols. The technical specifications for the challenges were being refined by joint committees that included both human and Grey Nebula experts working side by side. As the formal session drew to a close, Ambassador Drax approached Kale with what passed for curiosity among his crystalline people. "Ambassador Viran," he said, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of genuine interest. "I must ask, was this response planned, or did you truly conceive it spontaneously?" Kale considered the question seriously before answering. "A little of both, I think. We knew the Grey Nebula Collective had concerns about human unpredictability, but we never expected it to escalate to a declaration of war. When it happened, though..." He paused, searching for the right words. "It just seemed so absurd. Here we are, in the middle of the longest period of peace in galactic history, and someone wants to start a war because we accidentally make things better." He gestured toward where Thexan was engaged in intense discussion with the competition organizers. "The Warlord isn't evil, and he's not stupid. He's afraid. His people have built their entire civilization around the idea that order and predictability are the highest virtues. The thought that chaos and creativity might be equally valuable threatens everything they believe about how the universe should work." Dr. Vostok joined the conversation, her scientific mind clearly fascinated by the psychological and sociological aspects of what had just occurred. "It's fascinating, really. We're looking at a fundamental clash between two different evolutionary strategies. The Grey Nebula approach, careful planning, risk minimization, systematic execution, is excellent for preservation and stability. Our approach, rapid adaptation, creative problem-solving, acceptance of controlled chaos, is better for growth and innovation. And neither approach is wrong," Len added, her diplomatic training evident in her balanced perspective. "They're both valid responses to the challenges of existence. The problem arises when one side decides that their approach is the only acceptable one." As if summoned by their discussion, Warlord Thexan approached their group. His expression was still stern, but some of the burning hostility had been replaced by what might have been professional respect. "Human Ambassador," he said, his formal tone unchanged. "I find myself curious about your people's response to our declaration. In all our projections and analyses, we anticipated fear, anger, desperate attempts at negotiation, perhaps even preemptive strikes. We did not anticipate amusement." Kale smiled, but it was a gentler expression than his earlier laughter. "Warlord, can I tell you a story from Earth's history?" Thexan's expression suggested that he was not particularly interested in human historical anecdotes, but diplomatic protocol required him to listen. "Several centuries ago, before we reached the stars, there was a period on Earth when tensions between nations had reached a dangerous peak. Two major powers had built enough weapons to destroy the entire planet several times over, and everyone lived in fear that some small incident would trigger a war that would end civilization." The story clearly had Thexan's attention now, as the parallel to their current situation was unmistakable. Then, one day, one of these powers announced that they were going to demonstrate their superiority by launching a small satellite into orbit around Earth. It was a tiny thing, barely larger than a ball, and all it did was transmit radio signals. But the other power's response wasn't fear or anger or military mobilization. Kale paused for effect, his storyteller's instincts taking over. They laughed. They laughed because they realized that while they had been spending enormous resources building weapons of destruction, their rivals had been building something that would benefit all of humanity. That laughter diffused a crisis that could have ended our species. He looked directly into Thexon's glowing eyes. When you declared war on us for being unpredictable and creative, for occasionally making mistakes that turn out well, for refusing to accept that impossible things must remain impossible, how could we respond with anything but laughter? You were declaring war on us for being us, for the very qualities that have made us useful allies and good neighbors. For a long moment, the two stood in silence, representative of species whose worldviews seemed fundamentally incompatible, yet who had somehow found a way to transform a declaration of war into a friendly competition. Your story is instructive, Thexon finally admitted. Perhaps there is wisdom in seeing threat as opportunity, conflict as chance for growth. It was at this moment that the youngest member of the human delegation, a junior cultural attaché named Marcus Reed, chose to speak up. His youth and inexperience had kept him silent throughout the formal proceedings, but the relaxed atmosphere that had developed gave him the courage to voice an observation that had been troubling him. "Excuse me, Warlord Thexon," he said, his voice slightly nervous but determined. "But I've been studying the historical records of Grey Nebula civilization, and there's something I don't understand." The massive warrior turned his attention to the young human, his expression unreadable. "Speak." "Well, sir, according to our records, your people weren't always focused solely on order and predictability. Your early history shows a remarkable period of exploration and innovation. The Thexon Drive, which allows faster-than-light travel without dimensional folding, was invented by your ancestor, wasn't it? And that invention came about because he refused to accept that the speed of light was an absolute barrier. The silence that followed this observation was profound. Everyone in earshot, which, given the chamber's acoustics, included most of the assembly, turned to look at Thexon, whose expression had become completely unreadable. Marcus, encouraged by the attention and too young to recognize the potential danger of pressing the point, continued his analysis. "In fact, looking at the timeline, it seems like the Grey Nebula Collective's emphasis on absolute order only began about 600 years ago, after something called the Great Disruption. Before that, your people seem to have been quite a lot like humans, actually. Innovative, creative, willing to take risks." The young attaché pulled out his own datapad and activated a holographic display showing Grey Nebula historical data. "Look at this period here. They call it the Age of Bold Ventures. Your people were trying things that had never been attempted, pushing boundaries, exploring the impossible. The art from that period is incredible, dynamic, expressive, full of energy and movement." The display showed examples of ancient Grey Nebula culture, architecture that seemed to dance with light and shadow, sculptures that appeared to be frozen in the middle of dynamic motion, music that, according to the analytical data, contained mathematical harmonies that shouldn't have been possible with their physiology. "What happened?" Marcus asked, with the directness that only youth can achieve. "What was the great disruption that made your people decide that order was more important than innovation?" For several heartbeats, it seemed as though Warlord Thexon might not respond at all. His massive form stood perfectly still, and those close enough could see a complex play of emotions across his features: surprise, anger, pain, and something that might have been recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before, as if he were reaching deep into painful memories that his people had long tried to forget. "The Great Disruption," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen, was what your people might call a cautionary tale. 6 centuries ago, the Gray Nebula Collective was indeed, much as you describe, innovative, creative, willing to push boundaries and explore possibilities. He paused, and in that pause, the entire assembly seemed to hold its breath. We discovered something that seemed impossible, a way to manipulate the fundamental structure of space-time itself, to create stable rifts between distant parts of the galaxy. We called it the Gateway Project, and we believed it would revolutionize galactic civilization. The holographic display shifted to show technical diagrams and star charts, presumably records from the ancient project. The first tests were successful beyond our wildest hopes. We could step through a gateway on our homeworld and emerge instantly in star systems hundreds of light-years away. We began construction of a network that would connect the entire galaxy, making distance meaningless. His voice grew darker as he continued. But we had underestimated the complexity of what we were attempting. The space-time manipulations began to create cascading effects that we hadn't predicted. Reality itself began to become unstable in the regions around our gateways. The display now showed what appeared to be regions of space where the normal laws of physics had broken down. Areas where time moved in circles, where gravity flowed backwards, where the distinction between matter and energy had become meaningless. Entire star systems became uninhabitable. Billions of beings across dozens of species were displaced, as their worlds became impossible to survive on. The Gateway Network, which we had intended as a gift to galactic civilization, became the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. The silence in the chamber was complete now, as delegates contemplated the magnitude of the tragedy being described. It took us 2 centuries to develop the technology to reverse the damage, to restore normal space-time to the affected regions. But by then, the cost in lives and civilizations was incalculable. The Gray Nebula Collective made a decision that day. Never again would we pursue innovation without absolute certainty of the consequences. Never again would we risk such catastrophe in the name of progress. Thexan turned to face Marcus directly, his burning eyes reflecting centuries of collective guilt and determination. That is why we fear your people's approach to the unknown, young human. Not because we disapprove of innovation, but because we have seen what happens when innovation goes wrong on a galactic scale. The revelation cast everything that had happened in the assembly in a completely different light. The Gray Nebula Collective's declaration of war wasn't about disapproving of human creativity. It was about being terrified of what that creativity might ultimately lead to. It was Ambassador Kale who finally broke the silence, his voice gentle but clear. Warlord Thexan, thank you for sharing that history with us. I can't imagine how difficult it must be to carry the weight of such a catastrophe, to have an entire civilization's approach to existence shaped by a single tragic mistake. He stepped forward, his movement slow and respectful, as if approaching a memorial to the dead. But I have to ask, in the 600 years since the Great Disruption, how many innovations has the galaxy missed because of that fear? How many problems have gone unsolved? How many lives could have been saved or improved? How many wonders could have been discovered? Thexan's expression hardened. Better to miss opportunities than to risk another catastrophe. Is it? Dr. Vostok interjected, her scientific mind grappling with the ethical implications. Warlord, in those same 6 centuries, how many beings have died from diseases that might have been cured by medical innovations that were never pursued? How many civilizations have fallen to natural disasters that might have been prevented by technologies that were never developed? How many conflicts have escalated to violence because diplomatic solutions that required creative thinking were never attempted? She activated her own datapad, calling up statistical analyses that she had been working on for years. The data suggests that while the galaxy has indeed been more stable since the Gray Nebula Collective adopted their current philosophy, it has also stagnated in many crucial areas, Medical advancement has slowed dramatically. Technological development has become incremental rather than revolutionary. Even cultural evolution has been constrained by the fear of disruptive change. The implications of this analysis rippled through the assembly like shockwaves. For 6 centuries, galactic civilization had been living under the shadow of a single, catastrophic mistake, allowing fear to constrain progress across countless fields of endeavor. It was then that an unexpected voice joined the discussion. The Eternal Observer, one of the species selected to judge the upcoming competition, rarely spoke in public forums, preferring to watch and analyze rather than participate. When they did speak, their words carried the weight of genuine cosmic perspective. "The paradox you face," the observer said, "their consciousness manifesting as a shimmering field of organized energy, is one that has confronted intelligent life throughout the universe for millions of years. Progress requires risk. Innovation demands the willingness to fail. Growth necessitates the possibility of catastrophic mistake." The entity's form pulsed with patterns of light that somehow conveyed deep contemplation. Yet, catastrophic mistakes can indeed be catastrophic. The Gray Nebula approach is not wrong. It has prevented unknown numbers of potential disasters through careful restraint and systematic analysis. They paused, their energy field shifting to encompass both the human and Gray Nebula delegations. But neither is the human approach wrong. Your willingness to risk failure has produced innovations and solutions that have benefited countless civilizations. The observer's attention seemed to focus specifically on Warlord Thexan. The question is not which approach is correct, but whether it is possible for both approaches to coexist in a way that provides the benefits of both while minimizing the risks of each. This observation struck to the heart of the matter with laser-like precision. The competition that had been proposed was not really about determining which species was superior, but about finding a way for fundamentally different approaches to problem-solving to work together, rather than against each other. Len stepped forward, her diplomatic training having prepared her for exactly this type of complex negotiation. "What if," she said slowly, thinking through the implications as she spoke, "what if the competition were restructured not as a contest between opposing philosophies, but as an exploration of how those philosophies might complement each other?" She looked around the chamber, gauging reactions as she continued to develop the idea. "Instead of separate challenges where each side works alone, what if we structured collaborative challenges where success requires both approaches working together? Gray Nebula systematic analysis combined with human creative leaps, human innovative risk-taking, balanced by Gray Nebula, careful evaluation of consequences." The suggestion was met with intense interest from multiple quarters. The competition judges began immediate discussion among themselves, evaluating the feasibility and implications of such a restructured contest. Representatives from other species started considering what such collaboration might look like and what it could accomplish. But the most important reaction came from Warlord Thexan himself, whose expression had shifted from hostility, through confusion, to something that might have been cautious hope. "You would be willing to accept limitations on your innovations?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "You would submit your creative impulses to systematic analysis and risk assessment?" Kale nodded without hesitation. "If it meant that those innovations were more likely to succeed and less likely to cause harm? Absolutely. We've never been opposed to careful planning, Warlord. We've just never been very good at it on our own." Dr. Vostok added her support to the idea. "Some of our greatest successes have come from collaborations with species that approach problems differently than we do. The medical advances we've achieved working with the bioharmonic symphony, the engineering breakthroughs we've developed with the geometric perfectionists, they all came from combining different ways of thinking." Marcus, emboldened by the positive reception of his earlier historical analysis, offered another perspective. "And Warlord, What if working with humans could help your people rediscover some of the innovative spirit from your age of bold ventures? But this time with the wisdom and caution that came from the Great Disruption? You wouldn't have to choose between innovation and safety. You could have both. For the first time since entering the chamber, Warlord Thexan's expression softened slightly. The burning intensity in his eyes remained, but it was no longer directed outward as hostility. Instead, it seemed to be turning inward, as if he were examining long-held assumptions and finding them wanting. "The proposal has merit," he admitted slowly, each word clearly costing him considerable effort. "But the implementation would be complex. The Gray Nebula Collective has structured our entire civilization around risk aversion. Changing that approach would require fundamental alterations to our society." "Not changing," Kale corrected gently. "Expanding. Adding new tools to an already impressive toolkit. Your people's systematic approach and careful analysis aren't weaknesses to be overcome. They're strengths to be combined with other strengths." As the discussion continued, something remarkable began to happen throughout the chamber. Other species began offering their own perspectives on the collaboration idea, sharing examples of how their unique approaches might contribute to joint problem-solving efforts. The Aquatic Federation described their fluid approach to resource distribution and how it might complement both human creativity and Gray Nebula structure. The Crystalline Consortium offered their mathematical precision as a bridge between innovative ideas and systematic implementation. The Avian Collective suggested their aerial perspective, both literal and metaphorical, could provide oversight and coordination for complex collaborative projects. What had begun as a declaration of war was transforming into something unprecedented in galactic history. A systematic exploration of how the diverse approaches of different civilizations could be woven together into something greater than the sum of its parts. The formal session was officially concluded 3 hours later, but the real work was just beginning. Working groups formed spontaneously throughout the chamber as species that had coexisted peacefully but separately for centuries began exploring possibilities for deeper collaboration. As the great hall slowly emptied, Kale found himself standing with Warlord Thexan in one of the side chambers, both of them exhausted by the day's events, but somehow energized by the possibilities that had emerged. "Human ambassador," Thexan said. His formal tone maintained, but now carrying undertones of something that might have been respect. "I must admit that this day has not proceeded as our projections indicated it would." Kale chuckled, the sound now free of the sharp amusement that had characterized his earlier laughter. "Warlord, I have to confess that when I woke up this morning, prevent galactic war through the power of collaborative problem-solving was not on my agenda." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both contemplating the magnitude of what had just occurred. "There will be challenges," Thexan said eventually. "My people's commitment to order and predictability is not merely philosophical. It is embedded in our social structures, our educational systems, our very psychology. Changing that will not be simple." "No," Kale agreed. "And honestly, humanity's tendency toward chaos and improvisation isn't always an asset either. We've had our own share of disasters and near misses. Learning to think before we leap will be just as challenging for us as learning to leap will be for you." Thexan turned to face him directly, and for the first time, his expression was completely open and honest. "Do you truly believe this can work? Can species as different as ours find a way to collaborate without one dominating the other?" Kale considered the question seriously before answering. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I think the alternative, spending the next 1,000 years afraid of each other's differences, is worse than the risk of trying and failing." He gestured toward the main chamber, where the sounds of ongoing discussions could still be heard. "Besides, look what we've accomplished in just one day. We've turned a declaration of war into the foundation for the most ambitious collaborative project in galactic history. If we can do that, maybe we can do anything. As if to underscore his point, Len appeared in the doorway with her ever-present datapad, her expression bright with the kind of excitement that comes from seeing impossible dreams become achievable goals. "Ambassador, Warlord," she said, her diplomatic professionalism barely containing her enthusiasm. "The working groups have completed their preliminary assessments. The judges have agreed to the collaborative competition structure, and we've got representatives from 47 different species volunteering to participate in various aspects of the challenges." She activated her datapad, showing them a complex organizational chart that resembled a work of art more than a bureaucratic document. "The terraforming challenge alone is going to involve expertise from 12 different species, each contributing their unique understanding of planetary ecology, atmospheric engineering, and sustainable development." Thexon studied the chart with the attention of someone trained to spot potential problems before they became critical failures. "The coordination requirements will be enormous," he observed. "The communication protocols alone will require standardization across dozens of different sensory and cognitive frameworks. Which is why we need your people's systematic approach." Len replied immediately. "Human creativity can generate the ideas, but Gray Nebula organizational skills will be essential for implementing them effectively." The Warlord's expression showed that he was beginning to understand how the collaboration might actually function in practice. "And our risk assessment protocols could be adapted to evaluate innovative proposals without simply rejecting them for being unprecedented." "Exactly," Kale said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of seeing a complex plan beginning to come together. "We're not asking either side to abandon what makes them effective. We're asking both sides to share what makes them effective." Over the following weeks, as news of the unprecedented collaboration spread throughout the galaxy, something extraordinary began to happen. Species that had maintained polite but distant relationships for centuries began reaching out to each other with new proposals for cooperation. The model of combining different approaches to achieve superior results proved to be contagious, spreading far beyond the original Human-Gray Nebula partnership. The terraforming challenge became a showcase for what was possible when diverse perspectives were systematically integrated. Human biologists worked with Gray Nebula engineers and crystalline consortium mathematicians to develop atmospheric processors that were not only more efficient than anything previously conceived, but also beautiful enough to be considered works of art. Aquatic Federation specialists contributed aquaculture systems that transformed barren seas into thriving ecosystems, while avian collective meteorologists designed weather patterns that maximized both agricultural productivity and aesthetic appeal. The Diplomatic Crisis Resolution Challenge produced even more remarkable results. By combining human creativity in finding unexpected solutions with Gray Nebula systematic analysis of long-term consequences, the mixed teams were able to develop resolution protocols that addressed not just the immediate conflicts, but also the underlying systemic issues that had made the conflicts possible in the first place. But perhaps the most significant development came from the Cultural Integration Challenge. When asked to design systems for helping newly contacted civilizations join the galactic community, the collaborative teams produced something that went far beyond mere integration protocols. They developed frameworks for what they termed cultural enrichment, systems that didn't just preserve new civilizations' unique characteristics, but actually used those characteristics to enhance the broader galactic community. As the months passed and the challenges were completed, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in galactic civilization. The competition had been won not by either humans or the Gray Nebula Collective, but by the collaborative approach itself. The results of the joint teams consistently outperformed what either species had been able to achieve working alone. The final ceremony, held once again in the Great Chamber on Nexus Prime, bore little resemblance to the tense gathering where war had been declared less than a year earlier. Representatives from hundreds of species filled the hall, not as cautious diplomats maintaining careful distances, but as active participants in an ongoing collaborative experiment. When Warlord Thexan took the podium to deliver his final statement, his bearing was still unmistakably that of a warrior. But the hostility had been replaced by something that might have been wisdom. 1 year ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. The Grey Nebula Collective declared war on humanity because we believed that their approach to existence was incompatible with galactic stability. He paused, looking out over the diverse assembly. We were correct in our assessment that their approach was different from ours. We were incorrect in our conclusion that different meant dangerous. A gentle murmur of approval rippled through the chamber. What we have learned through this process is that our fear of catastrophic innovation blinded us to the catastrophic stagnation that was slowly strangling galactic progress. By refusing to take risks, we were taking the greatest risk of all, the risk that we would cease to grow, to learn, to become more than we were. He turned his attention specifically to the human delegation. Humanity taught us that it is possible to embrace uncertainty without abandoning wisdom, to pursue innovation without ignoring consequences, to risk failure while still striving for success. Then he addressed his own people. And we have shown that it is possible to maintain our commitment to careful analysis and systematic thinking while still participating in the grand adventure of pushing beyond known boundaries. The final element of the ceremony was the presentation of the new Galactic Collaboration Charter, a document that codified the principles and procedures that had emerged from the year-long competition. Unlike the original Alliance Charter, which had focused primarily on preventing conflict, the new charter actively promoted cooperation, innovation, and the systematic exploration of possibilities that no single species could achieve alone. As Ambassador Kale added his signature to the document, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. A declaration of war had become a celebration of collaboration. A crisis that could have shattered 1,000 years of peace had instead become the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization, one that was stronger, more creative, and more resilient than anything that had come before. The laughter that had started it all, the human response to the Grey Nebula declaration of war, had not been mere amusement at the absurdity of the situation. It had been recognition of a fundamental truth that had taken the galaxy a year to fully understand. The greatest threat to peace was not the chaos of innovation or the rigidity of tradition, but the failure to recognize that both approaches had value, and that together they could achieve wonders that neither could accomplish alone. As the ceremony concluded, and delegates began making plans for the collaborative projects that would shape the galaxy's future, one truth had become undeniably clear. After 1,000 years of peace, maintained through careful balance and mutual restraint, galactic civilization had discovered something even better: peace maintained through active cooperation and shared purpose. The age of mere coexistence was ending. The age of collaboration had begun. And it had all started with laughter,